full run? Or just one?
Just probably just this one. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a microphone check from the Aspen Institute, 1 DuPont Circle. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check for C-SPAN transmission. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think we're probably okay.
Levels all right?
Yeah. If nobody's come running in screaming yet, I think we might be okay.
Well, I locked the door. Should I do that?
Yeah. No, let's keep it locked. We good?
Kind of dark.
On I think you can actually bump up the switches.
Way if I wander it back.
I think there might be. Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah.
All these mics open.
Except for the two that are wireless.
Okay, she's just saying it sounds. Maybe we can bring it up and just set it on your collar right in there.
That definitely feels warmer than before.
Okay. We still checking audio?
I think we are, just real quick.
No problem.
Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is an audio check for C-SPAN transmission. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
She thinks she's hearing bleed over from the other mics, like this one isn't up all the way. Because when you were tapping on it, she wasn't hearing it. It didn't sound like you were touching it. Or, I mean, when you were moving it around, it sounded like we were picking it up from over here.
I mean,
Are all these mics up at the same level?
Yeah, we're breaking them down.
No. The one that he was on. Can you talk, Steve?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
That was just that one. Now the others are back up.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That sounds good to me in here. So.
Who's good on there? I see you back here. I don't think you're projecting that one. I don't think.
Was that from me, this one?
Okay, we're good. You don't have BlackBerry?
No, that was feedback. That wasn't a phone.
The only thing she said was that this one looks like it's still up a little high.
You want me to go through them again so we can, or are you happy where they?
I have to play with one at a time. I don't want if they're all up. I think that's what we're getting.
Right. Is that mixer not gate?
I'm holding it up, so just make it so it's straight. I think that's better.
Yeah, you're
I don't
right.
know if it's lined up right. Here, I'll take them to the back. Also, do you have the remote for the air conditioner?
Okay, I'm just checking to see what I've got. I may want to keep it under my feet if there's.
I know, it's right down, you know, it's a little bit like school days.
Just got my stuff that I can't.
Good, good. I like Meredith in your team. You should be
Oh, good.
very organized. It's
She's
very,
relatively
very,
new,
very-
so that's good
It's
that.
good. Me too. Pamela and my team is new too, and I feel like it's my best Christmas gift. Somebody who's an organized person can help. So and when they might, they'll have a stitch our name tags too, if you want to show us a little more.
Okay, I'll come out. I'll be ready to go. We're not live. Everything's fine here. Anyway. Thanks. Stuff you got.
I'm in trouble.
Grover's just got a bag standing inside.
No, he's here. It's full of them. I thought you were taking this place.
I'll do my invitation. Okay. Sure.
Just remind everybody if you have a BlackBerry.
Yeah, I think that would help.
What's that?
Think that would help?
Just a little bit. Your mic's not on. Yet, but anything you say,
So since my broadcast on you today, if you wouldn't mind turning off your BlackBerry.
The lesson will call you to give the answers to David's questions.
Right. So I do use my hands.
robot.
Yep, it's on. Okay. Doesn't matter what this is.
Hey, Grover. How you doing?
Stick around if you want.
Good seeing you. You were joking about we're going to debate your bag.
Oh, yeah. That's your first one. I wonder that.
It's my credit.
You've got to learn to track your gas and spend. Only try to
Sure.
Oh, okay.
camera's hand forward.
leave it off?
All these empty seats. I took 20 times. I know that. But what you said,
Okay. Good morning, brother. How are you? Doing well. Good to see you.
Handy dandy guide.
This is
Yeah. I've seen it before. A few others. I don't know if they've done it with any of them, because, most I don't think you really could, because it's not really fully specified, and there's still a lot of, there's some things you could do in there.
There were some of the ideas.
But you still have, they had, like, with their rate cuts versus
Some sort of
tax expenditures, those were kind of, I guess you could pick one of them. They're mix and match, but I suppose you could just say, okay. But I don't think they've done it. If they have, I haven't seen it. I'll just put it that way.
I think if we get an extra Canada, because that might help.
Tight briefing.
I think a lot of countries have tried that at start.
So good morning and welcome. I just want to remind everyone that we're live, so if you please turn off your cell phones, it'd be great. My name is Raymond O'Mara, and I'm the Senior Associate with the Aspen Institute Initiative on Financial Security. And we are all very excited that you're here today to be a part of what promises to be a very stimulating discussion. At Aspen IFS, we focus on helping all Americans save, invest, and own. From child savings accounts at birth to equitable tax policy that helps more Americans achieve financial security, to innovative investment options that allow more Americans to reach a secure retirement, Aspen IFS strives to promote the policies and products that help more Americans be financially secure. Today we brought this panel together, this illustrious panel, to take a step back and talk more fundamentally about the tough fiscal challenges that our nation faces. This morning's discussion, Shared Sacrifice, debating the contours of U.S. deficit reduction, will be an opportunity for an open and honest dialogue about the U.S. fiscal deficit and how decisions policymakers take today might impact both the financial security of American households and the broader vitality of our nation's economy. So with that, I just want to introduce our esteemed panel. First, we have Eugene Steuerle. Eugene is a fellow with the Urban Institute and specializes in tax and budget policy. Eugene was instrumental in the 1986 tax reform and as part of the Reagan Treasury Administration, and continues to be a leading voice in tax and budget policies around Washington. Next, we have Lisa Mensah. Lisa Mensah is the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Initiative on Financial Security. And aside from being a great boss, she is a leader in promoting economic security of the working poor, having worked at the Ford Foundation as the Deputy Director of Economic Development for 13 years before joining Aspen. Next, we have Andy. Andy Stern is the former president of the Service Employees International Union and is currently a research fellow at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. Andy was also a presidential appointee to the President's Commission on National National Commission on Responsibility
Fiscal Responsibility.
and Reform. That's right. Next, we have Grover Norquist, who is the president of the Americans for Tax Reform. At ATR, Grover leads the nation's leading tax advocacy group opposing federal tax increases at the federal, state, and local level. And next, we have Dean Baker. Dean Baker is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research at CEPR. He leads CEPR in promoting democratic debate on the most important social and economic issues that affect people's lives. And lastly, we have David Leonhardt. David Leonhardt is a columnist for the New York Times, where he writes on budget and tax policy, economics, and everything in between. And with that, I want to turn it over to David.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone, for coming this morning. We'll have a good holiday season discussion about the deficit. And we're not going to do opening statements. I thought we were going to really dive right in and get the conversation going. And it seems to me the fundamental question we're debating here is how big should government be and how do we go about paying for that government? And so I wanted to start with this panel with the first of those questions, which is how big should government be? There are a number of schools of thought on that. There's a school of thought that it shouldn't be any bigger and should perhaps be smaller than it is now. There's another school of thought that says it should basically continue to grow as the population ages. And so I guess I'd like to throw the question out of how big government should be. And I'd like to start a little bit of with a framework in which we accept that, or at least discuss that much of what government does is actually very popular. Medicare, Social Security, the military. And so in many ways the question is not only how big should government be, but given that right now the American people seem to want government to be bigger than they want to pay for it, how do we deal with the gap between those two things? And I'm going to start with Gene down on the end, who has been doing a series of emails, Government We Deserve. And then from there, I won't call on people. I'll just let the other panelists jump in.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for mentioning my column, which people can get if they send me a note. Actually, I'm going to twist your question around a little bit because I think in some ways it's the wrong question. I think whether government is 30% of GDP, now I'm adding federal, state, and local governments together, or 36%, say, as the average European state, is sort of a fundamentally unimportant question. I realize that that's where the battle has been over the last 20 years is, do we have the top tax rate at 40%, or do we have it at 33 or wherever else? And we go back and forth on this seesaw battle. To me, the most important question in terms of how we do things over time is how well do we grow the economy? Because growth in the economy largely determines how large government's going to be. It's not determined by whether we're 30 or 36 or 24% of GDP at any point in time, because the economy doubles over the next 30 years. We have the chance to double the revenues of government, double our personal incomes. And the other problem with defining it as how big government should be is I think the fundamental dilemma that we're in right now is that fight is the one that's preventing us from solving our problems. So we spend $30,000 a household. That's the federal government now. The federal government spends $30,000 a household, and it collects $20,000 in taxes. So neither side, neither liberal nor conservatives, are playing by a rule that says, what we do has to be in balance. I'm not saying it has to be in balance when you're in the middle of a recession, but that $10,000 gap continues into the future. We're spending 50% more than we're taking in revenues. And that is a big dilemma for government. And whether government's 36% or 30 or 20% of GDP, in some ways I care less than what we do is over time we get that system into balance, that we get both sides to play by a rule that says however big I want government to be, I'm going to pay for it. I'm not going to do spending increases I don't pay for. I'm not going to do tax cuts I don't pay for.
I'm going to agree with Gene, but carry it a step further that I think it is the wrong question. Because when we think about how big government is, I think we're really focusing on kind of a meaningless number. And I'll just give a few concrete examples. If we were to have, let's say, a single-payer type healthcare system, universal Medicare system, obviously that would substantially enlarge the size of government because all the money comes in, gets paid out. Suppose instead we have a universal mandate. That doesn't make the government bigger. Well, we've required people to buy healthcare. We're steering money in the economy. How is that not big government? We could all be happy that if we have the Bowles-Simpson, 21% rule, we could be happy maybe we're under that rule. But in all seriousness, we're still just as large in terms of the government's impact on the economy. Other ways, patents and copyrights, huge direction of resources by government policy. Currently, we spend about $300 billion a year on prescription drugs. That's because they're patent protected. They cost about a tenth as much if we didn't have patent protection for prescription drugs. I mean, there's other ways you could finance the research, but the point is that's government directing large amounts of money, about 2% of GDP. Third way, tax expenditures. So we give basically everyone a subsidy when they buy their home. We could do that two different ways. We could have a government subsidy and say, okay, we're going to tax everyone, and then we're going to subsidize the purchase of your home. That's big government. Instead, we have a tax code, and we go, you get a real big tax break if you buy a home, and you don't have to pay interest. You don't have to pay tax on your interest. Well, then that's not big government. I think it's just kind of a silly way to think about it. And of course, we're in Washington, so we're used to silly things. But that's not really what's at issue.
But it is, if we think about the actual politics of this, right? Like, I agree that we could create our own economy where we don't have to worry so much about how big the government is. But really what this debate is going to come down to is, do we keep Medicare as it is? And that is a decision to let government continue to grow significantly over time. Or do we fundamentally change Medicare, which is basically a decision to try to not let government grow? And it seems to me that right there, if you think just about Medicare, that is the essence of what's going to be very difficult. I agree, there are lots of solutions that could work, some bigger, some smaller, but we're going to have to make a choice about whether we let government keep growing or not keep growing. And Grover, you seem like you wanted to get in here.
Well, two things. On the question of government growth, what most free market conservatives are looking to do is something along the lines that Paul Ryan was talking about, which is to take entitlements, which are now pay-as-you-go, and if everybody lived 10 years longer, things would be worse in that world. And move to a defined contribution plan where if everybody lived 10 years longer, it wouldn't bankrupt the system. So you want to move to defined contribution. You're seeing that now in state legislatures. Utah just passed a law. This is not an idea. It's a law now in Utah. All new hires by state and local government in Utah will have a defined contribution pension. Whatever their pay is, 10% goes into a defined contribution plan, and there's no more creation of unfunded liabilities in the Utah system. A number of states will be following that path, and the federal government has largely moved in that direction on federal employment. And of course, you can do the same, make the same efforts, Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlements, Social Security entitlements. I do want to highlight one thing Dean said, because we tend to think about spending and taxes, and then we don't focus on what Dean was talking about, which is the regulatory burden. When the government doesn't take your money and spends it, but tells you, by the way, if you buy a car, you have to pay for the following 20 things. If you buy a house, you have to have these things. That regulatory burden now, the government's own numbers over $1 trillion, it's getting to be a big piece of it. And so if you want to talk about how do you get more growth without necessarily cutting spending in a particular area, you can reduce the regulatory burden to give you that growth that makes the government a smaller percentage of the economy.
Grover, let me ask you one specific thing, which is, I think the American people have been persuaded that they want low taxes, right? You've been part of persuading them.
We're working on it. So it's a work in progress.
It seems to me they haven't been persuaded that they want a size of government that actually matches those low taxes. Medicare remains extremely popular. Social Security remains extremely popular. When one party talks about doing something to change that, the other party runs against it. Republicans ran as the defenders of Medicare in this campaign. Democrats sometimes ran as the defenders of Social Security. How do you deal with that gap between the fact that Americans want low taxes, but they want a government larger than those taxes will support?
Sure. You campaign for choice, and that's where Bush had it right briefly, and then he lost the country because he went back to the old conversation. The original one was anybody who's younger should have the choice of moving into a defined contribution plan for Social Security without cutting the benefits if anyone's on Social Security or raising the taxes of anybody else, and simply saying we're now going to give you that choice. That was and remains a very popular, strong position. It would, over time, as it has in Chile and in some other countries, move people to a defined contribution plan that doesn't have these unfunded liabilities and has tremendous economic growth because almost everybody in the country is a significant shareholder and investor and owner of wealth as well as an income earner. So you do it with choices. You don't go in, because a lot of people are older or just uncomfortable with change, or they don't trust that 435 congressmen are going to get in a room with the president and a bunch of senators and give you a one-size-fits-all reform that's an improvement over the present. So when you talk about how popular some government programs are, compared to what? Compared to what politicians might impose on you, I'll stick what I got. Compared to a series of choices I could have, that's, I think, the way to go so that you don't end up with unnecessary opposition. I mean, you don't want to do things that people strongly oppose, but you also don't want to end up with opposition you didn't need because you gave people false or too few choices.
Lisa.
Yeah, I want to take off on Grover's point about choice. I think it's a great word. It's a true value. But I also want to say that when we make shifts from DC toward a defined contribution system, as we have done in our retirement system, it's a lot about shifting the costs and shifting the risk. And that really has extra toll on working folks. One of the reasons people didn't like the choice for private accounts in Social Security was that they understood the risk that entailed. And I think a deficit conversation can't get away from the fact that we can't control our costs by just shifting all the risk to individuals and individual families. We've had people, one of the reasons they like and crave the social insurance systems that Medicare and Social Security represent is because it's a way to reduce risk. That's a good thing for government. So in this deficit conversation, when we talk about the size of government, and I kind of like the question, I think, though, the nuance that I would put is that we can't control costs just by shifting costs. And I think Dean was getting to this a little bit more. And that a move to make more of the government borne by individuals, by a voucher system or more, that's just a risk shift that really puts it on the most frail side, which is an individual worker's circumstance without any fallbacks.
But we're all here because the Social Security system, a Ponzi scheme as structured, and the Medicare system, a Ponzi scheme as structured, that's paid for by people investing now for their future, and the money they invest for their future is going out the door the next week to pay people already in the plan. I mean, Madoff went to prison for this sort of approach. Ponzi got in trouble and had to go off to Italy because of this approach. So there is this huge risk. It's just politicians just lie to people about the risk. So when you talk about personalizing the risk by letting people, you're giving them control of their assets, whereas now they have none. The risk is there. That's why we're having this conversation, because these plans are about to fail. That's why.
Andy?
So I was hoping that Grover was going to give me his favorite quote, that he wanted to shrink government down to the size that he could flush it down the toilet, which I used that in remarks a number of times. But
drown it in the bathtub.
Drown it in the bathtub. I'm glad I got it right. So this is a conversation I think that's a little small in this sense. Our country and the rest of the world is living through the most profound economic revolution in world history. And if you think about the agricultural being a 3,000-year transition and the industrial being a 300-year transition, we are amidst of a very big structural transition. We had a jobless decade. We've seen the gap between the rich and everyone else grow ever wider. American workers haven't gotten a raise in 30 years. And the future doesn't look a lot better. So we need a plan. And people are right. Now we're just talking about what is the plan. But the truth is we need a plan that makes America competitive. And it is true that our Medicare system doesn't, but it's also true, as Dean said, we pay 5 to 7% than our competitors, than Germany, than Taiwan, than Switzerland, other people around the world. It's true that we have a tax system that has all kinds of gimmicks and tax earmarks that other countries around the world don't. And we don't have a tax like other countries do, where our exports are taxed coming into the country, but their imports aren't taxed coming into our country. So this is a question about where are kids going to find economic growth and jobs, and it's not an issue just about defined benefits or defined contributions, because there are ways to do all of those things. But America needs a 21st century plan, and we're still in the 20th century.
Will you talk a little bit about your investment idea? One of the things that I found disappointing about all the different plans is that they aren't focused enough on economic growth. And it seems to me your plan tried to do more of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear we have a fiscal deficit, obviously, but we also have an investment deficit. I mean, you can't talk to a business person or an entrepreneur that doesn't say there's all kinds of lack of investment, whether it's we look at China and high-speed rail, you look at our airports, our bridges, our water systems, our lack of a smart grid, and say, how is America going to do what we did in the Eisenhower years when the interstate highway was the basis of commerce and we built the best in the world, and now it's the internet highway, and we don't really have the best in the world. So there's all kinds of questions. And all I said is pay-go is a recipe for terrible decision-making about investment, because you have to hurt someone else to get the money for a country to invest. And so we just need, like we have a transportation trust fund, a dedicated fund in order to fund infrastructure and investment. Every business person agrees. I use some of the ideas that Dean Baker had of taking 0.25% financial transaction tax on stocks held less than a year, and you could actually raise an awful lot of money to do some really good things for the country.
Go ahead.
I think Andy's almost understating the problem. I think we have a budget for a declining nation. And that's not just a deficit issue. To me, one of the problems with always focusing on this issue as a deficit issue is a deficit is a symptom of a much bigger problem. And as long as we think that we're going to get at that problem only by sort of reducing the deficit, we don't get at such issues that Andy was talking about, which is how do we get more of the government to be really investing in people. And by investment, by the way, the biggest investment, the most important investment is in human capital, and it's in the young. That's by far the most important investment. And after the young, it's also to often a number of people in middle ages who often have career transitions and other things like that. That's the main investment we do as an economy. We also need the physical capital investment. And we're not doing that. And that's because between the deficits we're running, because we keep our taxes very low relative to our spending, so we're running up large debt, right, which is adding compounding interest payments, which we're going to just add to what our young people have to pay off. But also, even if we weren't, even if we had deficits near zero, this is a budget that's largely oriented towards consumption. It's largely oriented towards people of the age of the people on this panel. That is all of government growth. All of government growth is destined to add to our health care and our retirement benefits as we get older. We've done some numbers. We did some on mobility for the Pew Foundation. We did some on investment in children for the Casey Foundation. And you take the $1 trillion or more of additional revenues that are expected in the near future, and none of it is destined to go to children. That's just the growth usually get in revenues from economic growth as the economy expands by 20 or 30%. None of it's destined to go to children. It's a budget for a declining nation. And so that's why I say whether the government is in some ways 33% or 27% of GDP, I care less than it starts being a government that's really focused on the future. And a tremendous number of our programs, we could go through them from health care to Social Security to education. They were designed 50 or 100 years ago. We still have kids going home in the summer so they can work on the farm. I mean, come on. We don't have a system that is at all modernized. So we don't just have to get at the deficit. We've got to get at the fundamental structure of these programs.
Three people have talked about growth, and perhaps four. And I think that gives us some hope on a possible bipartisan progress here in Washington, D.C. If you want to look at spending, there's not going to be agreement. The Republicans in the House are not going to spend as much money as Obama wants, and they're not going to spend it on what Obama and the Democrats in the Senate want. So you're going to have gridlock, meaning not more spending out of the House of Representatives and out of Washington for the next 2 years. The big fight that just happened last night, where the dead hand of the last Congress tried to reach out a year and add $1 trillion and 7,000 thoroughly corrupt earmarks into the budget, was just defeated. So the new spending, or less spending, starts over the next 2 years. So there's going to be a fight there, and not too much is going to move, and I think that's reasonably healthy. But on the question of growth that you've addressed, there are two areas that Obama has actually led on that could be his version of welfare reform, and that is expensing for new investment, which he has said he's for, which is actually in a piece in this most recent tax agreement, which does reduce the cost of capital, which would create more jobs and opportunities and bring money to the United States. The other is reducing the corporate income tax rate, where we're at 35 federal, plus maybe another 4 or 5 state and local. And the rest of the world, Europe, is on an average of 25. Stupider than the average of Europe is not where we want to be on the corporate income tax rate. And we used to at least say we're not as bad as Japan, and they went and decided they're dropping theirs from 40 down to 35 to be below us when you count state and local taxes. So both of those areas are where both Obama and some of the left of center think tanks that he's worked with and Democratic members of the House and Senate. Expensing was Rostenkowski's idea in '81. The Reagan people foolishly didn't accept that and went with the accelerated cost recovery system, which is the economic equivalent of expensing, but a political mess, which was then, frankly, corrupted and messed up. Expensing is clean. Expensing drops about 1,000 pages out of the tax code. It makes things simpler, and it reduces the cost of capital, so the world will send capital here and not just lend money to politicians in cities and states and the federal government. So I think there's real opportunity on the growth side, and the whole point, the quote that you had of mine, the actual quote is the goal over the next 25 years is to drop the cost of government in half in 25 years as a percentage of the economy. And at the time I said it, and now it's my hope to do that largely by growing while you have a slower growth in government spending. You don't need to actually reduce government spending this year from last year, but you do need to hold it down while growth makes the government a less expensive cost of production. I mean, there's labor costs, there are capital costs, and there's the cost of government. And you don't want the lowest labor costs in the world. That's not what we want for the American people. That's not the way to get ahead. You want a lower cost capital by reducing the cost of government implicit in capital. And you want to reduce the cost of government as a factor of production so we can be more competitive.
Just a quick thing on corporate tax rate, responding to Grover. We do have a higher corporate tax rate, but in terms of what we actually pay, the effective tax rate, we're actually somewhat below the middle of the OECD. The other point, just to reemphasize this issue about growth, I recently looked back in 1996, the CBO projections for 2000. They projected a huge deficit for the year 2000. I think it was about 3% of GDP. Those of us old enough to remember, we actually had a huge surplus in the year 2000 of about 2% of GDP. That's a shift of about 5 percentage points of GDP, or be about $750 billion relative to the economy today. That's quite a lot to be off. And that was basically due to more rapid growth, in part due to the fact that the Federal Reserve Board allowed the unemployment rate to get way below the absolute accepted wisdom in the economics profession that you were a fool if you didn't agree with. At that time, the unemployment rate could not get below 6% if you were a serious economist. It actually got to 4% as a year-round average in 2000.
Let's talk about some specific taxes and how we might fund the government, whatever it is that we want. The deficit reduction plans have included discussion of whole new types of taxes. There's been a lot of talk about a value-added tax or a national sales tax, which would help move us, presumably, from this consumption economy to more of an investment economy. The Rivlin-Domenici plan included a soda tax, a tax on artificially sweetened beverages. There's also talk about a bank tax or a financial transaction tax, which are two different things. There's not a lot of talk about a carbon tax, but there's still some talk about a gas tax, which I have a hard time seeing how a gas tax can pass if a carbon tax can't. And then there's talk of fundamental tax reform. Which of these are actually likely to break out of commission reports and panel discussions and really have a serious chance of becoming part of our tax code or a bigger part of our tax code, say, 20 years from now?
I mean, I would say that, we're seeing the end of earmarks, both in yesterday's vote in the Senate, or lack of vote in the Senate, but also I think we need to think about tax expenditures really as earmarks. They're just ways that Congress, has actually allocated money to spend through the tax system as opposed to through a spending vehicle. And it totally distorts all kinds of different behaviors. So I think there's a lot of synergy, at least right now, to try to make the tax code simpler, make people understand, how much money they keep and how much money goes to the government depending on, a much less riddled with loophole tax system. I think that's good. But I think in the end, the competitive American economy, we always like to talk about the OECD rates for corporate taxes. We forget that most of them have some kind of consumption tax around the world that balances out whatever the loss is in corporate income taxes when you lower the rates. And it also taxes our exports to those countries, and we don't tax their imports to us. And so we have a stupid competitive economic system with the way we deal with our corporate tax income, and the tax expenditures just have to change. It's just that it's full employment for K Street lobbyists.
So you think tax reform, as it happened in '86, actually is somewhat likely to happen?
I think that is the easiest way forward right now.
The challenge you have is that you gave a 20-year. I was going to say no if you were talking about the next 2 years to all of your questions on all of those tax changes. But then
I got that sense, which is why I made it.
Then 20 years, and I'm going, well, okay, 20 years. There's 2 redistrictings and a whole bunch of other interesting project lines. There is potential agreement on something like an 86 tax bill where you reduce marginal tax rates, corporate and individual, and eliminate tax deductions and credits or reduce their value. There are 2 challenges there. One is, in '86, you had Ronald Reagan standing there with a baseball bat saying, make these changes, but anything that's a tax increase isn't getting past me. And then a lot of people who otherwise thought the tax reform was a dirty trick for tax increases, because people had talked about tax reform in the previous 15 years, eliminating deductions and credits, and end of conversation, using that to raise taxes. And as long as eliminating deductions and credits are in the context of a revenue-neutral reduction in rates, there would not be opposition from either the Republican majority in the House or Republicans in the Senate. But if that door isn't closed, nobody's going to walk into the room. And that's the challenge. If you can get that agreement that it's revenue neutral, lots of things are possible.
So let me get back to the dilemma I posed at the beginning. Is we're now spending $30,000 per household. That's total government spending divided by total number of households, and we're collecting $20,000 in taxes. And that gap doesn't go away if we keep current policies in place. That is, the current types of tax policies and the current types of expenditure policies. And so there's got to be give, it seems to me, on both the spending and the tax side. And that doesn't matter whether you're a smaller government or a larger government person. I mean, the gap is so large, and we're borrowing so much from abroad, and we're putting so many burdens on our young people that gap has to give. And so if we draw lines in the sand that says no tax increase whatsoever, including even a reduction of a tax expenditure, which, by the way, is a very conservative policy. It's like getting rid of a spending program. You know, if that's off the table, and we think we're only going to get there by cutting the spending, I think we're putting blinders on. But by the same token, on the spending side, this gets way back to your Medicare issue, David, is Medicare is designed like a lot of private systems. We basically had a fundamentally flawed design from the beginning in the late 1920s, where basically you and I go to the doctor under an insurance plan and we bargain over what everybody else will pay. And it is zero price for something we always want more of. That is a system that can't work. And what we haven't agreed to is what the reforms are to get at it. I mean, some people say, well, let's solve the problem by having Medicare for all and government's going to control everything. And other people say, well, let's just put all the cost on individuals, and because they've got fixed budgets. Both those give you budget constraints, but we're not happy with that. So we haven't agreed to what we're going to do there. But we've got to get at those issues, too. We've got to get at the growth, the automatic growth in spending that's faster than the economy, no matter what the rate of growth of the economy. That's unsustainable. And we've got to close that gap, and it's going to include some tax increases, including, I think, the tax expenditures that Andy talks about, which, as I say, is in the end, and the reason Ronald Reagan got converted on it, ends up to be a fairly conservative instrumental policy because it's like cutting a spending program.
Let's stay on the tax expenditures for 1 second, which is, and Lisa, I want to ask you this. It's from a flatter, simpler tax code perspective, getting rid of these deductions is great. There are a lot of people who feel like those deductions benefit them personally. The healthcare tax exclusion, the home mortgage deduction. I'm not saying these are great policies. I'm saying a lot of people think they are great policies. How do you deal with this tension between either the perception and or the reality that these are middle-class benefits and the middle class has just endured a decade with little to no pay increases?
I think it's a great perception. I think the tax code is not neutral here. We actually use tax expenditures to promote behaviors that we consider valuable, and some of those are very, very important to our middle class. I think that it's fine to have a conversation that's stimulated by saying get rid of them all and have zero. But I think the real place, and I'm going to vote for your fundamental tax reform, is not to eliminate all tax expenditures, but to reorient them. Gene and I served on a group where our fundamental question was, why aren't we using our tax expenditures to promote savings, real net new savings? Why aren't we serious about the kind of tax expenditure that would put every child into the investment system, everyone, with a $500 start on an investment system? That would be net new savings for the first 18 years of life. Why aren't we expanding it so that people can not only have a home mortgage deduction, but have tax savings for the first down payment so that we have more down and less debt when we go into homeownership? There are valuable behaviors that we as a society have said matter and that we use our tax code to get to. So in the fundamental tax reform, which I hope is coming, and in a flatter, simpler system, I hope we use a scalpel, not a cudgel, and that we keep some of the things that are just vital for the financial security of households.
Just to pick up on that, you've already spoken this. In terms of tax expenditures, you could get rid of or sharply curtail a lot of these. It doesn't make sense, at least that I could see, to let someone take a deduction on $900,000 mortgage at, say, a 39% rate. My dream world would go back to the old rates. That doesn't make sense. On the other hand, giving a middle-class person some mortgage tax credit, tax deduction, however you want to put it, that makes a lot of sense. I'd also like to get back to a tax that isn't discussed, and I'd have to say my bet would be it won't be passed, the idea of the financial speculation tax. I mean, it's kind of striking to me because, I've been through the economics on this, and At this point, I wouldn't say there's a consensus, but there's a widely held view within the economics profession, including at the International Monetary Fund, which is not a place known to be hostile to bankers, that the financial sector is bloated, there's a lot of rents there, and in effect a lot of easy money. And the point here is very, very simple. You have enormous salaries there that people could speculate. They're basically gambling, which is fine. I'm not prude and want to arrest people for gambling. But if you gamble in Las Vegas, if you gamble in Atlantic City, we tax that. Why on earth shouldn't we tax that here? And in terms of from the perspective of sort of the normal middle-class investor, someone who's got their 401k, it basically would be a wash. And there's good economic research on this. If I have $100,000 on 401k, and let's say it currently flips over 20% a year. And suppose we were to double the cost of transactions. Well, the research shows that it would flip over then 10% a year. That's neutral to me, and frankly, as a person who's money in 401k, I couldn't care less how many times my money flips over. It's not making any money for me, it's making money for the people who are flipping it. But yet, this doesn't get considered in Washington. You could get $150 billion a year from this tax. I've raised this with people in the Obama administration. They go, we wouldn't be able to collect it. It would all go overseas. And I go, well, you're going to have to tell the folks in UK that because they just tax stock trades and get the equivalent of $40 billion a year. I can't believe that they're that much smarter in the United Kingdom than the folks in Washington. But it's not on the agenda, and I think there's an obvious reason.
I know we're not going to get into a discussion of first principles here or in Congress because you don't move forward. But just for the record, when you hear the expression tax expenditure, understand that this says something very importantly. The idea that if the government fails to take a dollar from you, it has just spent that dollar, suggests, implies, says that the government owns all of your income, and if the king lets the peasants keep some of their money, then the king gave the peasants that money. When I walk down the street and a mugger walks by and does not steal my wallet, he did not give me that wallet, okay? The wallet was mine, it was always mine, and the fact that the mugger failed to steal my wallet, sorry for him, but he didn't give it to me, okay? And if the government doesn't take a dollar from you, it didn't give you that dollar, you earned that dollar. If you didn't earn that dollar, there's another question. But this is why when people throw up the term tax expenditure, they lose half of the audience, starting with the Republican side of the argument. If you want to get rid of tax deductions and credits and replace and reduce rates in order to have a cleaner code, a code that the government interferes in less, there's a lot of support for that. Again, that's what 86 was all about and why the 86 Tax Reform Act worked and was able to happen. But when you use the term tax expenditure and suggest that when the government doesn't take your money, it's giving it to you, there's a challenge there. I'm all for, and perhaps the way to do it, because you had said you don't want to necessarily get rid of all tax loopholes or deductions or credits, is to allow, again, choices, to say you can have the 35 rate and lots of deductions and credits, but as a way to transition over, if you want to get rid of the deductions and credits, here's a 20% rate. This has been suggested, and it may be a mechanism over time to be less disruptive for people who've planned their lives around certain deductions and credits, home mortgage and others, and may not want to give them up right away or ever.
I'm not sure you lose all Republicans, though, right? I mean, Marty Feldstein, I don't think you lose him. Tom Coburn signed on to the Bowles-Simpson plan, even though it used tax expenditures to raise money.
I don't believe he would vote for it. We had a conversation about this. I don't believe he'd vote for it if it was put up for a vote. He is not happy about the idea of raising taxes. He assures me in conversation.
Gene?
He did vote for the other. That's true.
The point Grover's making about it's your money is correct. The people contribute everything to government. And so when government gives them back the tax expenditure, they're just giving them back their own money. But the same thing is true with direct spending, as it is with subsidies in the tax code. It's the same thing. The government in either way is the one that's giving back the money. Yes, it's their money, but if you think you want to cut spending programs, I can design a spending program that's exactly the same whether I call it a tax deduction or credit or whether, in fact, I know that people sat in the Office of the Secretary of the Treasury where they sit around and say, we can't get this through as a spending item. Let's sneak it in the tax code and we'll do exactly the same thing. I've sat there in meetings where they do that. And they talk about it as exactly the same item. So all the complaints that it's your money, it is your money. And let's be clear about it. Ronald Reagan also favored cutbacks in what are called tax expenditures or some of these subsidies. He did it in 82. It was a major portion of the 83 Social Security reform, which went to the taxation of Social Security benefits. He did it in 84. He favored it in 87. So, I mean, yes, he was careful because on net he wanted rates to be low, which was his principal concern. But it's not like every subsidy in the tax system had to be kept pure. But I do think people are dodging one part of your question, David, although you posed it only with respect to one thing, and that is that the fundamental dilemma, the fundamental political dilemma facing our politicians, into which some of us often serve them because we sort of give them excuses, is that the middle class pays for most of government and it gets most of government. And when we're running these huge of deficits, the middle class has to be asked for what Lisa put on as the title of this session, which is shared sacrifice. Although it's a little misleading because I think it's shared sacrifice towards greater gains, but the middle class has to be engaged, and whether it's engaged in accepting some amount of tax increases or cutbacks in tax expenditures or lower rates of growth in Medicare or maybe no longer having couples have 30 years of retirement. I mean, the middle class at some level has to be engaged in that issue. It's not just an issue of taxing the rich, and it's not just an issue of getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse.
Let's get more specific now about some spending programs. And Andy, I'll start with you on this. How should we think about these proposals to raise the eligibility age for Medicare and Social Security? I understand that people of higher income have had bigger longevity gains than people of lower income. But when you look at when these eligibility ages were set, they weren't set 5 or 10 years ago. They were set, in Medicare's case, many years ago. And in Social Security's case, many years ago, and then changed only slightly. Is it reasonable to say to people, hey, you know what, we're living a lot longer, your Medicare isn't going to kick in at 65, it's going to kick in at 67, or is that a hardship that we shouldn't ask of people?
I mean, if that's what it takes to get things in balance, I would look at that, but I think they're just much more thoughtful, appropriate ways that allow you to keep things the way they are, but actually get the savings. Because what you're really looking about is not sort of individual policy decisions. You're trying to figure out, we have a healthcare cost that's ballooning, we have more people in the system, how do we deal with it? It is, an unsaid truth that other countries spend 5 to 7% less than we do on healthcare. I mean, they have figured out a design from Switzerland, which Newt Gingrich is in favor of, to other countries where they look at the entire healthcare system and have found a way to make it cheaper. I can't figure out, Barry Anderson, who was a Reagan CBO director, comes in and you ask him, well, what would you do if you really wanted to fix the healthcare system? He says, well, besides medical liability and other things, I'd go to a system like France has, where I live and pay 5% less and get equal good health care. So I don't know why we always go to sort of how do we take cuts as opposed to we are at a point in a global economy we need to make structural changes to compete. People are living longer, and I think we always go to sort of how, I'm not saying we don't have to make tough choices. Those are not the choices I would make on either side.
Very quickly, we did raise the retirement age. We are raising it to 67.
For Social Security.
Yeah, and
not Medicare, though.
In the case of Medicare, again, getting back to the point Gene and Andy just made, we are paying a lot more. We are not getting a lot more. So I think rather than focus on telling middle-class people they can't get the same health care, we should focus on fixing our health care system. We pay twice as much for our drugs as everyone else. Our doctors get almost twice as much. We pay God knows how much for insurance that, we have an incredibly inefficient insurance system. We should be looking to lower our costs. We can do that, but those are very powerful groups. So invariably, when you raise this with people on the Hill, they go, that's really hard to do. And it just, to my mind, kind of sort of mind-boggling. Okay, we have a problem here. We know it's really hard to fix, so we'll go and do something else. That's not making the tough choices, as these guys like to claim. It's running from the tough choice.
But I think there's a little bit of running from this issue of the retirement age. Let's suppose we accept all the changes everybody on this table wants. And now the remaining question is, do we change the retirement age? Let's suppose Social Security is in balance. I would still increase the retirement age. And the reason for that is if you look at Social Security, it's now the case that people are retiring for about 10 years more than they did when the first system was first established. In fact, when it was first established, people on average retired at age 68. If they would retire for about the same number of years today, that was about 13 years on average, today, as they did then, they'd be retiring at about age 75. And if you go forward about another 50 years, they'd be retiring about age 80. So thinking that we're going to design a retirement system, and the designs that Andy and these commissions are at, or what's the system going to look like in 2050, to think that we want to design a system in 2050 to look like it was designed in 1940 according to perceptions of the late 19th century about when we should retire is absolutely silly. So we're now moving to a world where approximately one-third of adults are going to be on Social Security for over one-third of their lives. So it's become a middle-age retirement system, and that's not good for the system. Even if all the money went back into Social Security, this is a threat to the very old. used to be that over half of all benefits in Social Security went to people in their last 10 years of life. Now it's something like about a third, because more and more is going to younger and younger people. So the system's less and less progressive. It's putting more and more money in people in the younger years of life, and I think it's a great threat to the very old. My numbers now show that the typical couple, if they retire at 62, will have one person liable to be alive for 30 years. They think they're ready at age 62 for what's going to happen to one of them when they're 90 or 92, and they're not. The numbers show that we are threatening the very old by this design of a system. And I also think, by the way, I think that putting so much money into middle-age retirement is also a threat to the young. But even if it wasn't, I would increase the retirement age just to fix that system. As I say, we're talking about a 21st century model. We want a 21st century Social Security system, and middle-age retirement, to me, is not a priority in how to establish an old age system. And by the way, Lisa, it doesn't. I know we've had this discussion. It doesn't disfavor minorities, because what happens is we've gotten these 10 years of extra retirement. Everybody on this table gets like $30,000, $30,000, $30,000, $30,000, $30,000, $30,000 additional benefits. And now there's three people out here we think we're sympathetic with. Well, we're sympathetic to the disabled. Well, increasing the retirement age doesn't affect the disabled at all, so we don't do anything for them one way or the other. We think we're sympathetic to people who die before, have shorter life expectancies, but the people who die before age 62 don't get any benefit out of helping the retirement system. And there's one person over here on the end who we do care about, who does have a tough time at age 62 or 63, who doesn't get the $30,000 we get, who gets $15,000. So to give that person $15,000, we're going to give all of us $30,000. It's worse than going into a poor area of the city and throwing money off the roof and saying that we're solving a problem. It's a very bad way to do things, and we can make a much more progressive and good system, I think, by getting at this retirement age issue, as tough as it is for people to think that we want to ask the middle class to do something.
Lisa?
I think it's one of the most popular and important programs we've come up with in the last 75 years. And I find it, the one thing I think is all the commissions have said is that Social Security actually isn't the deficit problem. So here we are at a deficit conversation, once again discussing raising the retirement age in Social Security out of sort of, I don't know why it's on the table. This is, we'll call you all back and have a different conversation for Social Security, but just to say, I don't think we're all the same. The incentives are there. You will get so much more from the Social Security system if you will delay your retirement to age 70. That's already there in the system. We have a system that already benefits. More will come. Those incentives are there. My group has already had an increase in the retirement age. We've put those things in place. So I think it's the wrong place for solving the retirement system, and I think appropriately you've got answers, David, that the Medicare challenge is a health care cost challenge. And I think that the very popularity of these programs tells us something about what Americans are holding on to as the basis of their financial security. So we change cautiously. Much of the gains that we've seen in longevity have actually come from keeping children alive. And I do think it's disproportionate how people live and how people enter retirement, their ability to work longer. And frankly, this is much more related to the jobs question. How many people will find gainful employment post-62 that continues their ability to work? So more complicated issue, not really a deficit issue, in my view, an issue that we've already dealt with. We dealt with it in the last Social Security Commission, the 83 Commission, already raised the rates of how long you have to work. So let's come back later. Let's have our own commission for Social Security. Let's deal with that fairly. Let's not lump it in. It is not the deficit problem, if they've said that. So,
but let me push you on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Social Security starts running a deficit absent its trust fund within the next 5 years.
I don't
right?
like the absent its trust fund.
No, absolutely. And then
So-
it's projected to run out of its trust fund in 2037.
Not run out, but run out of the trust fund, yes.
Yes,
okay,
so essentially to no longer be able to pay the promised benefits.
25% won't be paid in 2037 if
Right.
nothing is done.
Which would be a major political issue if everyone's Social Security was cut by 25%. So I understand that from an accounting perspective, it's different from the rest of the deficit. But shouldn't it be part of this discussion that we are on a pace not to be able to afford the promises we've made, or should it be treated separately because the accounting is separate?
It should be treated separately because it's one of the most cherished programs, and it's always been treated separately. So we should solve it, and if Gene is right and says even for budgetary reasons we need a different program, fine. But we shouldn't make a 25% cut now to avoid a 25% cut in the future. You know, that's my problem with this kind of math, which says, gee, storms are coming in 2040, and scaring people with the Ponzi scheme, which we don't need to do, I think. This is a social insurance scheme that Americans know and understand has worked. Too many communities, too many people understand the absolute vitality. I work on private savings, and all of that wonderful work on private saving is meaningless if you don't have an effective system of baseline insurance system underneath. So I think we should be careful. This is not the time to burn the candle at both ends, take cuts in one area and also undergird the security of our households by cutting Social Security.
Let's stay on healthcare for another minute. And Grover, I'll turn to you on this. We saw this incredibly bruising fight over health reform, which actually continues now in the courts. Let's set aside some of the specifics of that and instead talk about this healthcare cost issue. It seems to me, as I suggested before, it is the perfect example of people wanting more government than they want to pay for. That everyone talks about how important controlling costs is in healthcare. Yet when you actually get to any kind of legislative solution for that, or even regulatory solution, there is enormous political resistance. How dare you take away my healthcare? How dare you tell me no? Death panels, etc. Given that healthcare is so much a part of the problem, how do we get to a point in which people are willing to accept that we can have a system in which we can have absolutely every test and every treatment and every procedure that we want?
We're moving towards, particularly with the legislation, the 3,000-page legislation that everyone here, I'm sure, has read, to have the government take over healthcare. We're moving more towards a government monopoly structure. And I would argue that what we ought to be doing is moving in the opposite direction. If you want to keep costs down, I think that the history of the world suggests that competition keeps costs down rather than powerful monopolies. The only way a powerful monopoly can keep costs down is by rationing care, which is why people not unwisely say the government's going to handle all health care and they're going to crunch costs. Well, how do they do that in the post office? They don't deliver the mail twice a day. They don't deliver it on Sunday. They don't deliver it on... They ration... The way they drop the cost of post office care is to ration the post office. They don't become more effective. That's what the private sector does in UPS and FedEx. Step one, somebody slipped over it, but tort reform. What's different in Europe compared to the United States? One of the things, in addition to our high marginal tax rates on corporations that we do poorly compared to Europe, is our tort law. I'm not excited about billionaire trial lawyers who step in between everybody's contract and raise the cost of health care for all people. And that's a non-minimal additional cost. If you allowed people to buy health insurance across state lines, the way you can buy most other products in the United States from somebody in another state, the competition there, the government's own numbers suggest to drop 10 to 15% of cost. That helps with all health care. So I would go to more competition. We certainly see that. LASIK surgery is less expensive every year. What is it not paid for? It's not paid through government. It's not paid through third-party payer insurance. There's more competition. The same thing with cosmetic surgery, which is less expensive because there's more competition.
Those are optional surgeries, though, right? LASIK and cosmetic surgery. Do we really imagine a system in which people are going to go out and shop for chemotherapy the way they shop for LASIK surgery?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of health care that would have competitive advantages, and certainly health insurance, we ought to have that kind of competition. I am less excited about the government rationing care and more interested in looking for ways to give people more options and more competition in how they pay for that, and for innovative ways for people to save more money for their own health care, 401ks, health savings accounts, and so on. So there are a number of areas where we've been trying to move in that direction. The story of the last 10 years is the Democrats voting down all efforts to reduce the cost of health care through greater competition in order to force the crisis and give us a one-size-fits-all state-run plan. I think we need to go back at that again, and I think now we're having the conversation, and I hope we'll get there.
Grover, I agree with you in competition about taking a somewhat different direction. I see the monopolies as being the drug companies, being the medical equipment suppliers, and this really creates incredibly perverse incentives. Your paper had a very good front-page story today about how there's a testing company in Massachusetts that was hiring attractive women to get young men to sign up for their test. They got $4,000 from the insurance companies for each person. They can get a swab of their saliva for a bone marrow directory. This is absolutely obscene. Why do they do that? Why is there so much money there? Because I'm sure that's a patented test. This creates, economists, if this were an honest profession, economists could jump up and down hysterically if you talk about a 20% tariff on imported tires. But when you talk about having patents for drugs and prescription drugs and medical equipment, you aren't raising the price 20%, 200%. You're also often raising it 2,000%. These would all be incredibly cheap if they were sold in a competitive market. That's where we need the competition. We could pay for the research up front. If that sounds strange to you, you've never heard of the National Institutes of Health. They get $30 billion a year from the government. You can pay for the research up front. By the way, the drug companies insist that it's money incredibly well spent. So we can't think they're all morons. At least the drug companies tell us that those people are very, very bright and use the money very well. So that would be a really good place to have competition. We get much cheaper medicine and much better medicine because we won't have all these perverse incentives for Merck and Pfizer to lie to us about how great their drugs are. All go away. Another way to have competition, I originally said this as a joke, but I no longer think it's a joke because I haven't heard a better suggestion out there. How about Medicare vouchers where people could buy into the healthcare systems of countries that have much lower healthcare costs? We'd split the money. I can go to Canada. My wife's Danish. She'll get rid of us. We'll go to Denmark. We'd put $10,000 in our pocket each year, and the government would save the same amount. That's what the differences are once you get out 30 or 40 years. Those are the projected differences, not my numbers. Those are CBO numbers. So there are ways you could have competition that will drastically lower the price of healthcare, but I think they're more at the expense of the drug industry, the doctors, the medical suppliers.
Andy, you've thought a lot about healthcare. What would you like to see happen over the medium and the long term to control costs?
I mean, all Grover is talking about is we're going to ration care by the fact that you can't afford it, what you have, so you don't buy it, which we all saw before, and you end up, if there's no mandate, with no insurance, and so we ration care that way. I know lots of our members who never went to the doctors because they couldn't afford it. That's just a different form of rationing by income, which I think is where we end up with vouchers. This is not complicated. We have countries around the world that have all designed a healthcare system that's 5 to 7% less in cost. Different people like different countries about what they do, but none of them are based upon sort of the rationing method that Grover and the supposed competition, which never occurs in healthcare, as we all know. It's like trying to get rid of soft money. The costs just show up somewhere else as soft money shows up in any campaign in some different way. So why in the world does America not look at what our competitors do successfully? We all say the German economy is a miracle. It made it through all of this difficulty. What's wrong with their healthcare system?
You mean where in the German system, you don't have single payer, right? You have essentially a highly regulated system with a mandate, I assume, in which everyone gets private insurance.
And there's a lot of different sick funds or whatever they're called in Germany where you get choices. But it's a 5 to 7% lower cost. France, Taiwan, Singapore, look around the world. We do not have to believe this is this is not where America's uniqueness really is necessary.
This is a very brief aside, but I believe Germany's GDP has made less of a recovery than ours, although it fell further and now has come back faster. Anyone else on healthcare while we remain on the topic?
Well, again, I just want to point out the fundamental dilemma is that somebody has to say no. Somebody has to say that this price is too high. If a drug company says we're going to charge $1 million for the next pill, somebody has to say no. And there's three choices. I mean, just logically, it either has to be the government, it has to be the individual, or it has to be some intermediary. And I actually think that given the debate that goes on that we've had for ages, I don't think it's ever going to be purely the government. I don't think we're ever going to accept that level of regulation. And there's a reason for that, which has to do with the fact that if the United States really would go that far towards say a British-style system, is that how do we decide what healthcare is going to look like 20 years from now? It's one thing if you're Canada and you look at the United States and say, well, they're paying $50,000 for that drug. We think we can get by with paying $40,000. But if there's no market out there at all to determine price, who's going to determine this stuff? So it's not clear to me it can always be government. And individual doesn't work because of the reasons Lisa has raised, among other things. If you put too much cost on the individual, you're going to discriminate against those people who can't afford it, at least at that level. And so I think in the end, we're going to push a lot on this issue about how to do it with intermediaries. And that's both direction that Andy and Grover have talked about, but a little differently. In some cases, we talk about doing vouchers and premium support, which people like Alice Rivlin, good Democrat, tries to work on too. On the other hand, there are people talk about trying to bundle a bunch of goods and services in a payment system, so you just get so much of a payment per this elderly person for this set of procedures, and then the providers have to actually decide what they're going to do with that bundle. But I think we have to be honest about it. Somebody has to say no. And my bottom line on that is, therefore, everything we do in government systems have to be put in a budget, that you can't have open-ended budgets, because as long as it's open-ended, that people can sort of charge what they want or do what they want or always add more services, you never really get the system under control. And you lose the pressures to actually do the types of efficiency things that Dean and others have mentioned. You've got to put these things in a budget, no matter where you come out of, whether it's individuals, intermediaries, or the government. They have to be put somehow or another in some sort of budget to put that force of that constraint on the system to force us to decide to do these things efficiently and not let people just, especially the providers, to charge whatever they want or to provide every number of services they think they can get by with.
Let's turn to discretionary spending before we turn the microphone over to the audience. Dean, I'll ask this of you. What do you think is a reasonable target for waste in the non-defense discretionary area? 0 is an acceptable answer. Negative is an acceptable answer. But understanding that is not the main way to deal with the deficit, what is a reasonable target for how much we could bring down spending, not from the stimulus levels, but from where spending is supposed to be in 2012 or 2013? How much do you think we can save on the non-defense side?
I have to say, I wouldn't expect a net to see a savings because this is the investment component of the government, which doesn't mean that there's not waste there. I mean, certainly, we could find many areas, many programs have outlived their usefulness, just haven't performed well. So I would not have a problem saying that there are certainly programs that should be cut back or eliminated altogether. But the net story, where do I think we should be 2014, 2015, is almost certainly a higher level of discretionary spending, because this is where we have R&D in the budget, where we have much of our education, not all of it, much of the education in the budget, infrastructure spending. So we have a number of areas. Most areas that we think of as investment are in that portion of the budget. So I would actually say I'd have to expect it to grow larger rather than smaller, which again doesn't mean there's not a lot of waste that should be gotten, but the net I think is going to end up higher.
Anyone else?
I mean, I just think we have the budget structured wrong. I don't disagree with Dean, but I feel like we're never going to get real investment dollars for big projects that we need, whether it's, again, broadband, smart grids, high-speed rail, water and sewer, by trying to carve it out, of a discretionary non-defense budget. We have to have dedicated revenues like we have for the Transportation Trust Fund, which means we're going to have to hold discretionary spending down or reallocate it differently. In my plan, do actually take the same $4 trillion in a different framework out of the budget in terms of discretionary spending and a different ratio between defense and non-defense. But I do think we're missing an investment budget in this country, and you can't compete in the global economy. You can't not go to China and get worried about what our infrastructure looks like compared to what theirs about to become.
So you think we should essentially cut what is now the non-defense discretionary budget and take some or all of the savings and create a new category, which is an investment budget?
I wouldn't say that deeply, but I'm saying we have to certainly hold the increases, or flatten it out or freeze it for a while, take some of that money, but I think you're going to need new sources of revenue if you really want to do the kind of investment so that our kids have an economy, where they're going to have a job.
And what about on the military side? Grover, I'll start with you on this. We spend, $650 billion a year now on the Pentagon? Someone correct me if I'm rounding the wrong way. How much, a number of plans have suggested that we can get $100 billion a year out of that. Does that strike you as a reasonable number? Do you think we should not be cutting military spending at all? Where should we go on this?
No, actually, I signed a letter with about 30 other conservative leaders, which is just about everybody in the fiscal conservative movement, which said we need to look at reducing Pentagon spending and look at defense spending, because somebody had said you can't possibly cut anything out of the defense budget, including the $100 billion a year we spend to occupy Afghanistan, a country, I think, with a GDP of about $14 billion. I'm not quite sure how we do that, but we do. And the question is that something we intend to do for the next 50 years, spend $100 billion occupying the country? We're spending 25 to 50 occupying Iraq. Is that something, how long do we intend to do that? So at some point, one presumes that amount of resources can be saved out of the budget. The other question you have to look at is one of the best bipartisan, nonpartisan successes in reining in government spending was Congressman Sharp, Democrat, Indiana, and Dick Armey, Republican of Texas, who came up with the base reduction, realignment, and closure legislation, BRAC, which originally Army said, here are the 20 silliest defense structures in the United States. Forts set up to keep Boston from being invaded by Southern raiding ships in 1863, and things like that. They just didn't make any sense anymore. And immediately, the senators and congressmen in those 20 congressional districts and states went and traded their votes to defend these wasteful spending on unnecessary bases for sugar subsidies and other destructive spending. So we actually made negative progress on behalf of waste. And then they said, no, tell you what, we'll set up a commission, and the commission will come up with which bases to close. And there have been 6, perhaps 7 of those, largely successful. Every once in a while, Clinton stepped in and fiddled with it, and Bush #2 stepped in and fiddled with it on a couple of bases, which I think was unfortunate because they're both done for political purposes, California and Connecticut. But that said, if we can avoid politicizing those again, that kind of approach was one that was successful when it dealt with not spending additional resources. So that has saved billions of dollars out of defense. And the question is, how much defense do we need? And that's something we need to look at. But if you take it off the table, it's not just defense, waste in defense that continues. If you say that has to continue, then people who want to spend money on non-defense spending will hold hostage that wasteful spending. You only get your wasteful spending on defense if we get our wasteful spending on this program over here. So every dollar of Pentagon waste actually costs you $2, and because it's matched by wasteful spending elsewhere. So if you care about a serious national defense, you need to be very serious about stripping out waste, because $600 hammers undermine the case for a national defense period. And I'm all in favor of keeping an eye on the Canadians and keeping them on their side of the border, and we need a strong national defense to make sure that people don't attack us. That said, we ought not to be wasting money anywhere, and somebody who announces they're sacred cows then has to recognize other people's sacred cows, and nothing gets done.
Can I say one thing? I mean, we should just be aware, of the Russia phenomena. We're a country who tried to compete on the basis of defense and then rotted economically internally. I don't like bankers with ideologies, and that's what we have with China, because they don't have a fiduciary responsibility. They have a political and national responsibility, and them having this much debt for our country is not good, and we should learn the lesson of Russia.
To my mind, this is one of the most exciting things coming out of these various commissions, is that I do think there's a potential for a left-right agreement here on serious reduction in waste in the military, because I think I know a lot of people on my side of the aisle certainly agree with you very much on that.
It's fascinating if you go to Rand Paul's website and watch some of his speeches on defense savings. He's very strong on it, very strong.
There's another piece to this, and I just actually joined with a group called Right on Crime, rightoncrime.com, which are right-of-center activists re-looking at our criminal justice system, looking at successes from Texas, by the way, on how many people ought to be in prison. People ought to be in prison because you're scared of them, not because you're mad at them. And it's very expensive to put people in prison, and the prison guards union is a very expensive union, and there's the costs of putting people in prison are quite high. And we need to look at, are there ways to be serious about crime? I mean, I came into politics as an anti-communist. I'm very concerned about foreign policy. I'm very concerned about crime, but that doesn't mean one's in favor of being foolish and wasting money in either of those zones. I mean, the legitimate functions of government ought to be done with reasonable price and with a focus on how much they cost. The unnecessary and illegitimate functions of government ought to be left to other countries to mess around with. So it's not just defense, it's also the whole question of incarceration and the criminal justice system as to how we can effectively have less crime to the extent that people can be rehabilitated that happens, and that we do it at the lowest possible reasonable cost.
Let's hear from you all. We have a question back here, and we are going to have at least one microphone circulating. So,
thank you.
Please identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Jeff Cruz. I'm an independent consultant. I want to talk a little bit about the disconnect that Lisa mentioned. She mentioned in the context of Social Security. which has never contributed a single penny to the deficit and by law is barred from doing so. Later today, I believe, just up the street, the president's going to sign a tax bill, which is going to be the biggest deficit increase of his administration. And I hardly heard that mentioned at all during this panel. And there seems to be a particular disconnect with the members of the Deficit Commission. There were 12 represented officials who met for months and months and months and talked about the deficit. And now the majority of them voted for this tax bill, which drastically increases the deficit. So I want to know, how do you guys have plans to kind of bridge that gap between discussions about the deficit and actually enacting it into policy?
For my part, I'm actually, I was very much opposed to that deal because of what it did do with Social Security. I'm very concerned that it's just supposed to be a one-year payroll tax holiday, and after that, the payroll tax reverts to its former level, and the trust fund is supposed to be credited. That's unprecedented, but also I worry very much whether the Democrats in Congress and President Obama will stand behind that deal and say, okay, we bring the tax back, as opposed to a situation where we have a permanently lower Social Security tax, which will mean that you've basically doubled the long-term shortfall, which I would not do lightly. So I'm very, very concerned about that. But as far as the deficit, I have to say I am zero concerned about the deficit this year and next year, and that's because we have 9.8% unemployment. And the reality is that if we, if I made this joke yesterday, if we found our Department of Waste, Fraud, and Abuse and we cut its $1 trillion budget, you'd be cutting $1 trillion of demand in the economy. There is no mechanism that's going to bring that into the private sector demand at the moment. I know the normal story about crowding out, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. You can't tell that with a straight face today. So I'm not at all troubled by the deficit. I will point out that, I think the deficit hawks have been a little disingenuous on this because they're using, this economic collapse as a cudgel for beating back programs like Social Security and Medicare that many of us value highly. Reality, the debt that we incur right now is not a burden on our children because it's coming at the expense of basically greater unemployment. And in fact, there's no reason at all why the Federal Reserve can't simply buy the debt as it's doing today and hold it indefinitely. And what that means is that each year you got the Federal Reserve Board holding the debt, getting interest from the Treasury. The end of the year it pays it back. Last year they paid back $77 billion in interest, so almost 40% of net interest. There's no reason we can't do that when we have to worry about inflation becoming a problem, hopefully not too far in the future. You simply raise reserve requirements. And if you need a precedent for this, Japan's central bank holds an amount of debt that's roughly equal to its GDP. That would be about $15 trillion in the United States. Go look at Japan's inflation numbers. They don't have a problem.
Can I just say, I actually think Washington makes its best decisions when there's a crisis, and we're about to create one with a debt ceiling. And my sense is when we get to the debt ceiling, we're going to see deficit reduction of some sort, whether it's a trigger, that was somewhat proposed in the Bowles-Simpson plan, where we just begin a process that if you don't make a plan, things begin to happen. But if we think we're getting past rising the debt ceiling without a discussion of deficit reduction, I don't think in the Senate or the House that's really going to happen.
What's the deadline on the debt ceiling?
Second quarter of this year.
Second quarter. The end of the second quarter.
I think in terms of laying blame, if we have so-called deficit hawks who worry about the deficit doves who don't worry about it, I think you could find a lot of blame on both sides. And part of it has to do with the fact that the long-term deficit issue and the short-term deficit issue are very different issues. The short-term issue is sort of what do we do in the short run if we think we should stimulate demand. But if you look historically at what's happened when we've stimulated demand by running deficits historically, they got followed by a period where we sort of either ran surpluses or we reduced the debt quite drastically. And it wasn't just due to economic growth. It was due to the fact that there was discretionary spending that didn't actually have automatic growth built in it. The long-term issue, which is unique in all of our history, is that we have this spending curve, largely due to this automatic growth in healthcare and this very rapid growth in number of retired people and the way we've structured some of our retirement programs. The spending curve is growing faster than the economy, and so it never comes around. And so you've got to get at this long-term issue to get the budget in order. And where the rubber hits the road is that for the first time in U.S. history, in 2009, we were at a point where when Congress walked in the door, every dollar of revenue had been spent. That is, we had cut taxes enough and allowed this automatic growth to grow enough that the automatic spending, so-called entitlements, if you hear that language, the automatic spending including the interest on the debt, was in excess of all the revenues. And so every decision Congress made on the discretionary side, every decision it made to anything it wanted to expand, to deal with the deficit, to deal with the recession or anything else, had to come out of financing additional deficits. And so this confusion of long-term and short-term really messes up our ability to figure out how to solve these problems. And I think the debt commissions have the right focus. Their focus was mainly on the long term. In fact, none of them really came out for doing much in the first year or two at all. Now you can debate whether it should have been 1 or 2 or 3 years, but their focus was trying to get at this long-term problem, which is very serious. And the problem is because this long-term problem has been allowed to get so bad, it has actually weakened the case of the people who do think we need short-term stimulus, because they sort of often dodge the long-term issue. And by dodging it, and by allowing this debt to GDP constantly grow, it's really putting additional pressure on the system to solve the long-term problem by doing short-term fixes. So it actually reduces our ability to have stimulus, if you want to, by dodging this long-term issue.
We have a question here.
Frank Raines, former director of OMB. Really 3 comments to really try to provoke you into throwing things back at me. First comment is general agreement in the first part of the discussion that you have to talk about fiscal policy, not about budget deficits. That we really ought to be talking about how to create a growth economy that can compete in a very competitive world with the appropriate size government, tax rates, tax system, appropriately designed programs, appropriate investments, in order that the United States is the most competitive country in the world at a time when there are a lot of other competitors who have a lot of other advantages that they already have in place. And that discussion we rarely have as to what should our overall fiscal policy be. Where I fundamentally disagree with all of you is that you then proceeded to take off the table anything you cared about as one of the tools to create that fiscal policy. So that in each case, if there's going to be a so-called cut, of course that must then be reinvested in my thing. And we saw this with the health care bill. Many of the items that used to be on the table for deficit reduction went to pay for vast expansion of our health care system. Similarly, the Social Security advocates will say the money needs to be reinvested in Social Security, and Grover would say the money has to be reinvested in bringing down the tax rates. So everyone takes off the table the biggest things where you could actually have an impact on fiscal policy.
So let me just say, Frank, the only one I think I took off the table was investment in children, because I think that's getting crimped already. It's already paying the price.
The one thing you learn as OMB director is there's somebody who loves it all. and all of it has flaws. You sit through these reviews, there's always someone who loves it, and every piece of the budget, every piece of the tax code has a flaw. Every piece of the regulatory system has a flaw. The third point I'd make is, and this is more of an admonishment to fellow Democrats, when you reject the market as a tool for allocating resources, understand what you're doing is appointing Washington, our little budget office, the Congress, and our regulators to then do that allocation. When I sit and think about having a national health budget, for example, and we're going to determine whether or not we have enough doctors in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, based on somebody here making that determination, it causes me a great deal of difficulty because it can't be done. And it is the best way, ultimately, to undermine the authority of government and the prospect of government, to ask the government to do things that it nor any other big entity can do. I don't even understand how many of our big corporations are able to function with 150,000, 250,000 employees worldwide. The idea that government can make these fine-level decisions is hard to believe. In the healthcare area in particular, because it's so close to people's hearts, even though I've never quite understood why health is more important, for example, than food, where none of us believe there should be a government farm, none of us believe there should be a government store, but we think that, and we have a system of assistance there through vouchers called food stamps. But if you apply the exact same thing to healthcare, we think it's entirely fine that the government has its own hospitals, the government has its own distribution system, and vouchers there would be a horrible thing. But somehow health is different than food. And the last point I'd make on this is just going to Dean's point about difference in cost. It turns out we do have some competition here, not a lot in healthcare, but some. And it, in fact, can cost you half as much to get treated for the same disease with the same outcome if you go to Rochester, Minnesota, as opposed to going to Miami, Florida. So competition has crept into even this horrible system we've got now in healthcare. But my admonition is a broad one. Expecting that we really can allocate in a big economy like this and do it right is really to set yourself up to fail, regardless of your philosophy. I'm just talking practically. Can it be done? And my experience sitting when the government was somewhat smaller, and I remind you the budget was balanced, is that it can't be done, that we don't have enough people. And if we did, they would make a lot of mistakes, and that would then undermine the authority and reputation of the government to an extent that could be irreparable.
Well, I feel somewhat admonished. I actually, let me point out, the government already does do a lot of these things. For example, the government decides how many people go into med school. That's one of the reasons why we pay our doctors so much, because we restrict the number of people in med school. We decide the number of foreign medical residents that come into the country, and during the Clinton administration, that number was cut in half. So that's, again, been one of the factors pushing up the cost of health care. I don't, Andy, of course, will speak for himself. I don't envision the federal government micromanaging the health care in this country, but I do envision, actually in some ways I would say a lesser role, because as I said, I'd love to get rid of patents on prescription drugs, patents on medical equipment. There's no reason we should ever make the choice Gene was talking about. No one should ever be looking at paying $1 million for treatment for a year with a prescription drug, because if you didn't have patents, it would probably cost $200. We set up the question the wrong way, inevitably we'll get the wrong answer. So my view is not necessarily one that requires more government intervention. It might actually require less. In terms of programs being sink or sank, I wasn't, again, I'm just speaking for myself. I wasn't putting that much being sink or sank. I do think if you have a Social Security tax, it's a little dishonest to tax people for Social Security and then use it for X, Y, and Z. I understand we're lending the money from the trust fund, but under the law, that money goes back to Social Security. So I would say, again, I'd be opposed to cutting Social Security, but if we did cut it, I would certainly say, well, we shouldn't be taxing people, calling it a Social Security tax, and then using it to fund the Pentagon. I just don't think that's very honest. Last point, again, I just, I wasn't saying that in jest when I was talking about Europe. It's not my ideal way of reforming the U.S. healthcare system, but if you gave people Medicare vouchers, it would produce savings. I don't see harm in it. And the other point I would say about it is that we have a lot of people, I know Sarah Palin's going around the country saying everyone in Canada is dying because they don't have health care. If people had the option to go to Canada, to England, to all these countries that had actually longer life expectancies than the United States and put money in their pocket, they would talk to people back here. I think that would give us better perspective about the world. So I really see this kind of a no-lose proposition. I would trust Grover, my friends on the right would like this. What's wrong with giving people a choice?
I'm in favor of choices. I don't know how many hospitals there are just across the border on the Canadian side, taking Americans coming across the border. I am familiar with the other flow.
Who's next? Here we go.
Hi, my name is John Morton. Until recently, I directed the Economic Policy Department at Pew, and I'm now part of the great big bathtub, Grover, federal employee. Question is for you, and it is, I want to thank Aspen for putting together a very handy chart on all of our chairs here. Which
is this on the web, this chart? Does anyone know?
It represents a lot of work on Aspen's part, but more importantly, it represents a ton of work that's been done over the last 12, 15, 18 months from commissions, right, left, and center, coming up with ideas on how to tackle a national problem. And every one of them has taxes on the table in some form, most of them in some significant form. And yet, today, to make it through a Republican primary, one has to sign the pledge. And it's getting back to Gene's point, which is that therefore the door is closed for discussion about any one of these options once you've signed that pledge. And so my question to you is, and Voinovich said it yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I'm sure you saw his quote, and I have it here. He said, how in the world can someone that's an elected representative give their proxy on this issue to someone else? And yet that's precisely what incoming Republicans do these days. They say taxes are off the table. This chart suggests that they can't be. So the question is, how do you square that circle, and how can we take the pledge seriously if we're trying to, as all these efforts have, trying to square that circle?
Well, the Taxpayer Protection Pledge is a commitment that elected officials, not Mr. Voinovich, who until the last minute was planning on voting for the $1 trillion 7,000 earmark budget last night, but somehow was pulled back from doing so. He's also on his way out to be replaced by a senator who promised the voters of Ohio that he would not vote for a tax increase. This is a commitment, which Mr. Voinovich evidently misunderstands, to the voters and the citizens of the states, of the senators and the congressmen who made that commitment. I believe there are about 240 members of the House, 41 senators, and 1,300 state legislators, 14 governors have made that commitment. And take a look at those states like New Jersey, where the governor says, I'm not raising taxes, and he took $10 billion out of what they were planning to spend and reined it in. In those states where governors say, oh, taxes could go up or down, I can negotiate, you have California and you have Illinois. I think one of the things that's most exciting is not Washington, D.C., which is going to be in some gridlock for the next 2 years, and it's my hope that we elect a pro-taxpayer, pro-growth president and Senate 2 years from now. But for the next 2 years, there's going to be a disagreement about what direction to go in. Look at the 50 states. We have 21 states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures, most of whom have committed we're not going to raise taxes. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia. And we have a number of states run with Democratic legislatures and Democratic governors. New York, California, Illinois, Massachusetts. And I think it's going to be very instructive for people to take a look at those states which are open to tax increases and those states where elected officials say, I'm not going to raise your taxes, I'm going to rein in spending. That's the difference in the approach. If you think the problem is spending, which I do, raising taxes does not solve the problem. It's like giving liquor to somebody who's trying to stop drinking. You're an enabler, not somebody who's solving the problem. So taxes off the table are the only time we get spending restraint, which is why Americans for Tax Reform ask candidates to make that commitment to their constituents, not to us, which Voinovich seems to misunderstand.
In the 90s, didn't we get both tax increases and spending restraint?
From 93, you had the Clinton tax increase, which passed with only Democratic votes. And from 93 until 3 weeks into the Obama administration, when he raised taxes on all those people who earn more than $250,000 a year smoke cigarettes, that 16-year period was a 16-year period without tax increases. That was the longest period in American history without tax increases. We did have a cut in the capital gains tax, which gave us better growth in the late 90s, and you also had a collapse of Clinton's spending plans. He didn't spend as much as he and the Democrats had planned to before the Republicans took the House and the Senate. So you have both less spending than anticipated and stronger growth.
But isn't that the point? You know, we did both in that period of time. We had a surplus when it was over. And then we went to the jobless decade of George Bush and big deficits under George Bush, and then a fiscal collapse because we had less regulation of the financial market. So I'm not sure going back to the Bush era, where we only deal with one side of the equation or we lower taxes actually, really is an answer either. And so I think you need a plan that has both sides of the equation. I mean, let's just be honest. If there's a spending problem, that should be dealt with, but not in the absence of saying we're never again going to raise revenues.
I want to associate myself not with Bush. I didn't at the time, and I do not now associate myself with Bush's spending plans. And I think they were expensive to the country.
I think the political dilemma is we define this thing as taxes and spending, where in the political world, I no longer even divide the government that way. I divide it into sort of what I call the giveaway and the takeaway side of government. The giveaway being the tax cuts and the spending increases, and the takeaway being the tax increases and the spending cuts you do to finance the other side of the balance sheet. And politically, we've gone to a government that basically has within, I'd say since about 1997, has operated only on the giveaway side of the budget. Everything has been following Frank's lineup. It's basically been spending increases for domestic discretionary. It's been spending increases for entitlements. It's been spending increases certainly on interest on the debt, which is at least projected to grow quite significantly once the interest rates go back up. It's been defense increases, and it's been tax cuts. And that just does not balance the sheet. And so politically, the dilemma, back to my notion of asking the middle class for something, is that what we're into at this point in time is going to the public and asking them that they've got to give up something. And that includes the middle class. And we haven't been there for about 13 or 14 years. And it's going to be a fundamental problem, and it's going to include taxes, and it's going to include spending. Just a footnote of this, too. I think the tax you collect is not equal to the tax you're assessing on the public. The tax you're assessing on the public is equal to the spending. So all of these budget agreements, by reducing spending long run or reducing the taxes you have to collect to support that spending, the fact that we spend $30,000 now and leave $10,000 of the taxes to be paid by our children doesn't mean that that's not a tax. The tax rate, in my view, or the taxes we collect is equal to the spending we're doing. And in these budget agreements, if we really do cut long-run spending, we're reducing taxes.
I think we are out of time, but I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the Aspen Institute. This handy guide to the different budget plans will apparently be at some point on the website of the Aspen Institute Initiative on Financial Security. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks. Europe thinks the tax reform has a plan that doesn't include taxes. Of course it's true that none of these do. These are all left-wing plans.
No, I had the same thought, which is Paul Ryan's plan should.
Yeah.
It's worth adding Paul Ryan's plan.
Or ours, if you're going to
It's already pretty small print.
And then drop Galston.
What's your plan? Is there a simple two-sentence description?
It scrunches domestic discretionary, it goes back to defense.
Hi, Lisa.
It's got all the things I might have said. It doesn't balance it.
Where do you leave revenue at? What's your GDP?
We leave revenue. With the exception that if you actually get some trouble.
Oh, yeah. It was a good discussion.
You enjoyed it?
Yeah, it was fun. I don't know that I heard anything
halfway between Georgetown and sometime in my old.
You were brushing right up against what I think is a real problem, the confidence of government.
So I'm curious.
What makes you think if you raise taxes, you'll get the money to legislate new benefits like in health care they'll be able to implement? I think we've hit a sort of...
everything that increases choice is
treated back to the deficit. Maybe we can do something along those lines. I'd like to get my only ally is to be on the right.
We just can't broken. Government is really broken. Not just the legislative branch, the executive branch. I mean, to me, one of the things you might write a government reserve column about is how bad it was the IRS implemented as opposed to creating a new agency. And go back to SSA implementing Medicare, where you had an agency that was doing things like that. And then eventually stepped away from it. But I don't think there's any agency